Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. It's a pleasure, as always, to be with you, ladies and gentlemen. And today we have some excellent Thomas Wolfe footage for you guys and gals, and that will be the discussion/analysis of The Hills Beyond by Thomas Wolfe, our good friend, my favorite writer, Thomas Wolfe. I thought it would be a good time to make some more Thomas Wolfe videos. We've been coming out with a lot of different Thomas Wolfe content. We will be moving on to some other authors. We're still continuing the Dostoevsky project. We're reading some Tolstoy. We're reading a lot of different things during this holiday season. We've got some Charles Dickens coming up in the near future, but today it's going to be all about The Hills Beyond. Now, this is a posthumously published Thomas Wolfe novella slash short story collection slash compilation. And some of these were published publicly, some of these were published posthumously, and some of them are taken from his various novels. Now, the interesting thing about The Hills Beyond is that the first half of The Hills Beyond is not actually titled. Well, obviously the whole compilation is called The Hills Beyond. The whole novella, the whole volume is known as The Hills Beyond. But the actual Hills Beyond novella does not actually start until, you can see the title page here for The Hills Beyond, and it actually doesn't start until page 201. So The Hills Beyond is really two separate sections. It's really two separate novellas, and the first half of it is a collection of different similarly themed Thomas Wolfe works, all compiled into the first half, like we said. But the actual Hills Beyond section, like I said, does not occur until the later half of the novel. Now, before we get into the meat and the potatoes of The Hills Beyond, what actually is The Hills Beyond? Like I said, it is a posthumously published work. If you all are Thomas Wolfe fans, readers, or scholars, aficionados, you'll know that a good majority of Thomas Wolfe's work was unfortunately not published until he died. He left a lot of his work to Edward Aswell after he left Maxwell Perkins at Charles Scribner and Sons. And by that time, he had, accumulated numerous amounts of written material, stacks and stacks of short stories, skeletons for novels, novellas, some poetry. But really, Thomas Wolfe's passion was, if you're familiar with Thomas Wolfe, is his fascination and his celebration, rather, of his family heritage in the South. And by the end of Thomas Wolfe's career, he sort of graduates from the Eugene Gant Pentland sort of saga, the Eugene Gant Dixieland saga, and he sort of moves on to the George Weber universe, which we've discussed this many times in our Thomas Wolfe videos, but just as sort of a refresher, the later part, or the whole entire section, rather, of The Hills Beyond, that being that second half of the novel that we just displayed for you, is all of the George Weber universe. Now, the earlier short stories in the beginning portion that we discussed are sort of a mixture of mostly the Eugene Gant cycle and also some other various plays and different topics that range outside of the Eugene Gant / George Weber universe. But as far as the Hills Beyond section is concerned, as we said, that begins on the later half of this volume. But like we said, The Hills Beyond goes back in time into the Joyner family. Now, if you are familiar with the George Weber universe that occurs in The Web and the Rock, as well as You Can't Go Home Again, you'll be familiar with George Weber's maternal ancestors, which were the Joyners. And they're somewhat mentioned throughout the anthologies of You Can't Go Home Again, as well as The Web and the Rock. And we learn a little bit about George Weber's early life, where his mother's family came from, but he was orphaned at sort of a young age, hence the name Weber. I think that must have been his adopted father's name, something to that effect. But he has this knowledge and this deep connection still with his maternal ancestors. And as we discussed in You Can't Go Home Again, he actually goes to visit them, and we get to know the Joyners a little bit more, sort of on a surface level, as far as the close familial impact that they had on the protagonist, George Webber. If you're not familiar, George Webber is sort of the later protagonist that sort of replaces Eugene Gant. But it's sort of a similar family dynamic as we've discussed. But before we get into the bulk of what occurs in the Hills Beyond, I did want to take you through all my beautiful, lovely, colorful, in-depth annotations, and we're going to sort of discuss the themes that are brought to the forefront in Thomas Wolfe's You Can't Go Home Again. Now, it took me a while to sort of sink my teeth into The Hills Beyond. I started it maybe a couple of years ago, and I liked sort of the first half. But by the time I got to the actual Hills Beyond part, I had sort of lost interest for whatever reason, because I was more focused on Thomas Wolfe's earlier work, his big, chunky novels that he wrote, and sort of the Eugene Gant / George Webber universe. And this, I think The Hills Beyond is more of a acquired taste for very, very intense, heavy Thomas Wolfe fans, if you will. It's not something that you would pick up if you're not familiar with Thomas Wolfe. Let me know in the comment section if maybe I'm wrong, but it's hard to appreciate The Hills Beyond unless you've read Thomas Wolfe's other work, unless you're familiar with not only his writing style, but also his sort of familial heritage, rhetoric, and his sort of post-Civil War, pre-Civil War, early Southern country bumpkin sort of universe that he celebrates in his writing. And obviously you might be familiar with Eugene Gant and Dixieland and William Oliver Gant and, Eliza Gant and all the Pentlands, some of the Pentland family, which was, sort of Eugene Gant's mother's, sort of side of the family. But by the time we get to The Hills Beyond, it's sort of a look back in time, if you will, sort of a kaleidoscopic, panoramic celebration / analysis / historical document but it's written like a novel, obviously, or a novella, sort of George Webber's maternal family in the Carolinas and during the time of the Civil War, and then it sort of continues and goes all the way until the early 1930s or 40s. So it's very, very fascinating. I would definitely not skip over The Hills Beyond if you are a Thomas Wolfe fan. It's an essential read, but it's interesting. It's going to be sort of I wanted to mention the fact that it's split between the early section that occurs in the volume, and then the later part is technically what The Hills Beyond actually is. But I'm going to take you through my annotations of the entire volume, and we'll sit here, hopefully have some tea, a nice glass of wine, a nice cold beer, maybe some hot coffee, or maybe you're at the gym, hopefully doing something productive, and you can spend some time over here learning about The Hills Beyond with us here on In-Depth Literature. So The Hills Beyond opens with this story called The Lost Boy. You might be familiar with this if you're a Thomas Wolfe fan. Now, I will say, as much as I love this volume, I recommend reading the single exclusive volume of The Lost Boy, because this has The Lost Boy in its entirety. And this actually has like maybe 30 or 40 more pages that were actually cut out from this version for whatever reason. But The Lost Boy is interesting. If you're familiar with Thomas Wolfe or not, he lost his his older brother rather, Grover, at a really young, I think, it was his older brother. When Thomas Wolfe was really little, he was almost too young to remember it. But some of his family members remember it. And that's what The Lost Boy is. Hence the title, The Lost Boy, is about his brother Grover. My annotation here says, The Lost Boy is a story told about Eugene / Grover through different family members' narratives. And that's what makes this Lost Boy little short story really interesting, because it's sort of a retrospective, sad, sort of cathartic reimagining of not only the death but the life of his brother Grover that passed away. And he passed away at like a Kentucky fair, I believe they went to, when Thomas Wolfe was really little. The beginning portion begins with the sort of celebrating or sort of explaining, reenacting a first person perspective of Grover. And he goes to the candy store, and there's this really stingy sort of old grizzled man there that sort of tries to take advantage of the young Grover, because young Grover has these stamps and he's sort of trading in the stamps for in exchange for candy, which he's probably not really supposed to do. And the guy kind of gets fed up with him, and then Grover sort of leaves disgruntled, and then he walks across the town to William Oliver Gant's stone cutting shop, and that's where we sort of get these beautiful recreations, these reimaginings of William Oliver Gant. And it was so great to sort of go back into that universe and see more sides to William Oliver Gant and sort of the relationship that he had with his children, that being Thomas Wolfe and Ben Wolfe, and in this case Grover, and sort of the other people that are around his stone cutting shop. And William Oliver Gant walks Grover back to the candy store, and he demands that the old man, sort of apologize and give him back the stamps that he took. There's sort of this little back and forth between William Oliver Gant trying to protect his son Grover, and sort of the old man just being really stingy and really stubborn and trying to teach the young Grover a lesson. And then we sort of move on to this other section where Grover begins to take ill. And this is when we get the Thomas Wolfe's, or I should say Eugene Gant's sister, or Grover's sister. You can see here, part 2 is called The Sister. This is sort of the reimaginings of what it was like to experience Grover Gant getting really, really ill. And sort of the Lost Boy, the title sort of describes for us that Thomas Wolfe's little brother, Grover, that this novella is about, the Lost Boy, is almost like this heroic, saintly, angel type figure. And by the end of the novella, I don't want to give the entire thing away, but you'll sort of start to understand the tragedy of it. And then the Lost Boy takes another turn on page 30, and this section is called The Brother. And this is a more modern, sort of a more recent reimagining when Thomas Wolfe goes back to the house that Grover passed away in, and he sort of knocks on the door, and about 20, 30 years have passed, or however long it's been since his little brother passed away. And he knocks on the door, and obviously there's a new occupant living there, and he sort of starts to talk to this woman, and the woman says, "Why did you knock on my door? What's the real reason you're here?" And Eugene Gant confesses, or I think the woman actually kind of pulls it out of him and says, "Your brother died here, didn't he?" And Eugene Gant sort of melancholically reimagines and explains and has this beautiful conversation with this woman regarding the death of his little brother Grover. And he explores all the wonderful Thomas Wolfian themes of time and love and the briefness of our days and familial relationships. And there's this beautiful, poignant section. I don't want to tell you everything that happens at the end, but Eugene Gant turns the corner as he's leaving this location where his deceased brother perished, and he sort of turns around like this, and Thomas Wolfe writes that Eugene turned to look to see where time had gone, and he sort of remembers these beautiful flashes of distant memory of his brother that are now faded into the forgotten past. And we get this beautiful exploration not only of the tragic loss of Grover Gant, but just these beautiful descriptions and explorations, like I said, of time and memory and familial loss, but also the reflections of his family members of the impact of losing Grover Wolfe. And the reason I'm bringing up the exclusive edition of The Lost Boy is because there's another little section explained by Eliza Gant where they were actually on the train with Grover, and Grover has this confrontation with this African American man, and unfortunately Eliza Gant is sort of using Grover as sort of a vehicle to sort of justify her own prejudice. But it's kind of an interesting little segment that for some reason they decided to take out of the more published version of The Lost Boy. But if you really want to sink your teeth into The Lost Boy, this is really the best way to do it. And like I said, some of Thomas Wolfe's volumes, some of the material that is in The Hills Beyond can be found in some other volumes, some single volumes. Some of it is taken from some of his novels, but overall, this is definitely a unique experience, and you should definitely get every copy of Thomas Wolfe literature that you possibly can, because some of them are different. Like I said, this one is a little bit shortened, and then the full version exists here, and you get the whole panoramic perspective of the impact of the loss of Grover Gant on the entire Wolfe family. So it's really, really beautiful. The second little short story here is called No Cure for It, and this features it's a really, really short story. It's only like maybe less than 10 pages, maybe less than 5 pages actually, now that I'm looking at it. But Eugene Gant is sort of a young adolescent, or maybe a toddler, and he's starting to get really tall and gangly. If you're familiar with Thomas Wolfe, you'll know that Thomas Wolfe was very, very tall, skinny, at least in his early life. He got a little bit overweight towards the end, but his mother's concerned because she says he looks like a monkey and his body is not developing properly, and just this really sort of fascinating, funny, hilarious, tongue-in-cheek sort of mother-son bonding. But then the doctor sort of stops by and starts poking at Eugene, and Eugene has to do all these sort of demonstrations, touching his toes and holding his arms up in the air for the doctor. And the doctor basically just says, your son is absolutely fine, he's just a monkey. And Eugene, my annotation basically here just says Eugene is a monkey, because they just have this sort of funny, hilarious, lighthearted exchange of Thomas Wolfe's growing developments, his physical ailments, his physical awkwardness as a young Thomas Wolfe. And it was just kind of fun. It's interesting to kind of read that. Not a super profound story, but sort of shows a lighter touch of what Thomas Wolfe was capable of in terms of humor and dialogue and so on and so forth. So page 49 introduces us to sort of this, it's more like a play, but it's called Gentlemen of the Press, as you can see there. And it's a bunch of these sort of grouchy, grunchy, grumpy sort of newspapermen, and they are debating on what is going to be the leading story of their local newspaper. And this topic of they want to publish a story about a fire that took place in the Negro community, but some of the other reporters and writers and officials at this particular location are sort of saying that no, that story is not newsworthy. We should focus on the white inhabitants of this particular location. And there's sort of this back and forth, and we get some really beautiful characters. It's actually been a while since I've read this, and it's a little difficult to read because it is set up as a play, so you kind of have to keep track of who's saying what, and there's a lot of sort of fast, sort of short dialogue, but it's a really fascinating perspective into the former writing career of Thomas Wolfe. If you're not, or if you are familiar with Thomas Wolfe, hopefully you remember that he started out as a playwright, and he doggedly attempted to get his plays published in New York, and then eventually Elaine Bernstein actually tried to help him get his plays published, but nobody wanted to touch his plays because they were far too long. If anybody knows where to get some type of copy or anthology of it, or if any of Thomas Wolfe's plays exist anywhere in a printed form, please let me know, or if maybe they've been performed somewhere. But like I said, the Gentlemen of the Press featured in The Hills Beyond here is a good little introduction into Thomas Wolfe's playwriting career, and you can see where he sort of used the play format, the drama, the stage format, if you will, to sort of develop his dialogue and his characters. And it's a really fascinating retrospective into the technical mind and techniques of Thomas Wolfe's writing style. Now, by the time we get to 77, page 77, we have this beautiful story called Chickamauga, and this is sort of a during the Civil War retrospective of the old Civil War of the Pentland side of the family. Now, the Pentlands were sort of Julia or Eliza Gant / Julia Wolfe's sort of ancestors that came from the mountains and all that sort of thing. So it's sort of different from it's obviously different from the Joyner universe, and it's obviously different from the W.O. Gant universe that we see, familial universe that we see in the beginning of something like Oh Lost or Look Homeward Angel. But this is a beautiful feature in the Hills Beyond anthology, and we get these beautiful descriptions of sort of the burgeoning sense of excitement and wonder and potential blessings that people thought that was going to take place, as after the war or during the war. There's sort of this sense of rebirth that happens when a community first goes to war, but by the end of the whole cycle, people realize how bloody and how horrible and cruel and corrupt the Civil War was, or any war for that matter. We get these beautiful descriptions of some of the Pentland family members, that being Julia Wolfe's maternal, maternal and paternal ancestors that took place, or that joined up with the Confederacy, and sort of these conflicting mindsets surrounding war. Why are we going to war? What's the purpose? Are these people that are starting the war, are they really all they cracked out to be? This side of Thomas Wolfe's family, during this pre-Civil War days, the Pentlands actually did not even own slaves, so they were not necessarily even invested in sort of the antebellum, the continuation of the old antebellum philosophy or economy or lifestyle, and they were just sort of these mountain people that sort of just inadvertently got dragged into sort of the heroic legend of the war, if you will. And obviously some of them were drafted. They didn't really have a choice. We sort of get this beautiful and saddening, profound disillusioning of this warlike mindset. All these people are sort of patriotic, and they want to have some excitement, and they get to hold guns, and they get to march, and they get to train, and all these sort of things. But as the story sort of continues, Thomas Wolfe shares with us the disillusionment of a beautiful mountain community, a country bumpkin sort of community that was totally destroyed by the illusion of war, and they were taken advantage of by the war economy and the war sort of philosophy that young people are often subjected to. And we get these beautiful descriptions of how some of his family members, what it was like to actually enter battle, and the wounds that they suffered, and sort of some of the military camps where people were getting their limbs removed and sawed off, and there was blood everywhere and filth and decay, and just these beautiful, just astoundingly visceral, my annotation actually says here, visceral descriptions of carnage, and I will read one for you here. I reckon many a wounded man was just left to die or burn to death because we couldn't get him out. You could see the nurses and the stretcher bearers moving through the woods, and each side hunting for its dead. You could see them moving in the smoke and flames, and you could see the dead men laying there as thick as wheat, with their corpse-like faces and black powder on their lips, and a little bit of moonlight coming through the trees, and all of it hit more like a nightmare out of hell than anything I had ever known before. And I was just totally floored by this short story called Chickamauga, and a little bit more. We get into this sort of philosophical descriptions of Thomas Wolfe putting himself into these characters' heads, and that war is a complete hellish nightmare, and there is nothing heroic about it other than the initial excitement that you quickly become disillusioned to. My annotation here says nightmare was death and hell. I'm not sure where I was going with that, but you can see I've underlined and highlighted certain sections, and just this beautiful, profound sort of middle finger, metaphorically, if you will, of the Civil War. And although Thomas Wolfe is fascinated by the history of his family and the history and sort of the motives and the reasons for the Civil War, he is far from celebrating the carnage and the cruelty and the manipulation that took place, and brothers fighting against brothers, and just completely beautiful. I'm not going to tell you everything that occurs in this short story because it is sort of a panoramic preview that I'm giving you. So now we're going to move on to the return of the prodigal, and it's also known as the return of the prodigal son in some publications. This happens to just title it The Return of the Prodigal, and this is a beautiful sort of Thomas Wolfe, very typical Wolfian sort of themed story about Eugene Gant returning from his career as a writer after he has been exiled from his hometown in Asheville/Altamont, and he tries to go back and sort of make amends not only with the reputation that he has currently. Nobody wants to, he was basically chased out of town. People sent him threatening letters and, hurled abuses at him because he wrote so bitterly, or he wrote so impassionedly rather, about his hometown and his upbringing and all the people that he knew. And the title, The Return of the Prodigal Son, sort of is a metaphor for sort of this rebirth or sort of this forgiveness, perhaps in a biblical sense. But Thomas Wolfe sort of sets the story up in 3 different sections, I believe. And the first section is titled The Thing Imagined. And this is sort of what Thomas Wolfe or Eugene Gant assumes or projects or believes might occur when he comes back, sort of the reactions of his family, the reactions of his friends, his constituents, etc. A little bit of paranoia. And he reflects on his mother, Eliza Gant, quite a bit in this. And we get this beautiful descriptions of sort of similar to something we would see in Of Time in the River, or perhaps Look Homeward Angel, and we get these beautiful descriptions and disturbing explorations of his family. And then we come to the second part, which is the real thing. I think there's only 2 parts instead of 3. I'm sorry. The real thing. So there's the thing imagined that it begins with, and then there's the real thing. And Thomas Wolfe sort of has to face the fact that sort of the heroic sort of form of escapism that he sort of imagined, or this heroic triumphant return that he sort of had in his mind, is actually much more awkward and sort of visceral and uncomfortable in reality. And it says here, Eugene Gant had been 7 years from home, and many times in those long years of absence he had debated with himself, I will go home again. I shall lay bare my purposes about the book, say my piece, speak so that no man living in the world can doubt me. Oh, I shall tell them the thing is crystal clear when I go home again. Concerning the town's bitter and ancient quarrel with him. I love how Thomas Wolfe uses the word ancient, even though it doesn't really fit in this context, but everything is ancient to Thomas Wolfe here. And he says, concerning the town's bitter and ancient quarrel with him, he knew that there was much to say that could be said. He also knew that there was much to say that could never be spoken. But time passes and puts halters to debate, and one day, when his 7 years were up, he packed his bag and started out for home. And he has these reflections of his family and his father's heritage, like we see in Oh Lost, where his father witnessed some of the battles of Gettysburg and some of the soldiers marching, and everybody was dressed in rags. And we get this further disillusionment of sort of the Civil War philosophy, but this impassioned remembrance, or this impassioned sort of heritage that Thomas Wolfe reconstructs for us about his, sort of paternal and maternal ancestry, and just these beautiful descriptions of how Thomas Wolfe felt returning back to his hometown after so much had went by, and he is sort of sneaking around in the rain, and he just lies up in his old former bedroom, and he remembers his brother Ben that passed away. If you've read the ending of Look Homeward Angel, I've kind of gave that away, I'm sorry. Anyway, and we get these beautiful descriptions of how things don't change in a small town, but some things have changed, obviously, but sort of the essence and the sort of motions of society and the economy and sort of the spiritual mechanisms of the Old South are still very, very much intact in Thomas Wolfe's heritage. And he says here, Shantytown was also still the same, with the branch mire running in the depths, yellow rank with sewage, and the smells were just the same, the sour reek from the iron laundry pots mixed in with the branch mire smell, and the acrid tang of wood smoke from the shacks. So too, no doubt, with the smells the same inside of shackdom, the smells of pork, urine, funk, and darkness. Just these really visceral, disturbing descriptions of what Thomas Wolfe sort of perceived Shantytown to be like, what he perceived and believed it looked and smelled and was like. Obviously, Thomas Wolfe's perspective was somewhat limited because he didn't actually live there, but he delivered papers there as a child, and we get these beautiful sort of cross-cultural references to different communities that Thomas Wolfe interacts with. And sort of by the time we get to the end of The Return of the Prodigal Son, I'm just going to refresh my memory here. It sort of ends with this conversation between him and his mother sort of wants him to settle down. Eliza Gant is begging him to just get a cabin and settle down, and the phone is ringing constantly. Everybody wants to see him. So we can see that his return, his triumphant return to Altamont/Asheville was much more positive in some ways than he had kind of imagined. He had imagined that he was going to still be the same pariah that he was 7 or 8 years ago when he published his first novel, Look Homeward Angel. But time passes, wounds heal, and most people by this time were just offended that they were not featured in his novel. And we sort of get this sort of disillusionment of this this morbid fantasy that Thomas Wolfe had, that everybody was going to be out to get him. And it's just a beautiful exploration of Thomas Wolfe's literary career, but also Thomas Wolfe's sort of original community in Asheville that he came from and that so heavily influenced him. And we get family relationships and sort of all these people by this time kind of want a piece of Thomas Wolfe because he's such a famous, successful writer. So by the time we get about halfway through The Hills Beyond, we have this interesting story called On Leprechauns. Now, my memory is a little bit fuzzy on what this was. I think it's sort of a retrospective of, it's sort of a literary critic writing about George Weber and sort of getting literature out of this sort of safe Puritan sort of style or rhetoric, and the fact that he appreciates what George Weber, aka Thomas Wolfe, was able to do with literature. And we sort of get these explorations of what makes good American literature or foreign literature, what writers should be known for, what they should be motivated by, what themes they should be exploring. And it's pretty short, and it's got some really great lines. But like I said, my memory is a little fuzzy on what exactly it was about. But it's about the publishing business and sort of George Weber's writing career as a whole, told from the perspective of these other literary people. Now, by the time we get to page 150, we have Portrait of a Literary Critic, and this is a really good example of Thomas Wolfe writing about somebody else outside of the Weber, Gant, Pentland, Joyner universe, and he does that quite well. Well, actually, this is part of the George Weber universe. It's somebody that's known to George Weber. It says here, the personality of the celebrated Dr. Turner, or Dr. Hugo Twelvetrees Turner as he was generally known to the reading public, was not an unfamiliar one to George. The novelist Dr. Turner's wider reputation had been well known to the public for 15 years or more. So this is sort of a exploration of this Dr. Turner, and he lives with this servant. We get these hilarious descriptions of Dr. Turner sort of bossing his servant around, and his servant is like sort of this very overly polite, always around sort of chubby type of character, and he calls him Sugar Lips, and Dr. Turner sort of slowly gets fed up with him always being around. And we get some references to William Faulkner as well as here. It says, a few years later, however, when Mr. Faulkner's Sanctuary appeared, the doctor had so altered his views after likening the author to Poe in the quality of his brooding imagination, his sense of the macabre, his power to evoke stark fear, sheer horror, as no other writer of his time has done. So he's sort of exploring through the eyes of Dr. Turner, sort of the current writers that are around during Thomas Wolfe's time. And there's references to Ulysses by James Joyce as well, William Faulkner. And we sort of get this really fascinating panoramic view of Thomas Wolfe's contemporaries, if you will, and just these beautiful descriptions of this sort of crabby, curmudgeonly literary critic, and just these beautiful descriptions of what contemporary writing was, could, and should be like. Now, following the Portrait of a Literary Critic, we make our way to The Lion at Morning, which is a really fascinating sort of spiritual, aesthetic celebration, description, inner dialogue, philosophic thing from Thomas Wolfe, short story, titled The Lion at Morning, about this man named James who sort of awakens in his house, and he's disillusioned with his life and his wife and all the fancy things that his wife has collected, and he sort of viscerally studies and observes his own body in the mirror as he's getting out of the shower, brushing his teeth, and he sort of notices the wear and tear of the years as it's sort of snuck up on him. And he does, unfortunately, sort of resent his wife for all the random things that she's sort of collected over the years. But we get this beautiful philosophic exploration, celebration of time and memory, like we've seen in some of the other former Thomas Wolfe stories. But it's a wonderful example of Thomas Wolfe writing about another character from the perspective of another character. You can really see how Thomas Wolfe was trying to break out of the Eugene Gant / George Weber universe, and he does that really brilliantly in The Lion at Morning. A little excerpt here to sort of conclude what we've been saying here. It says, "Old James looked in upon the faded guilt of morning with a baffled eye. Where had it gone to then, all of the passion and the fire of youth and the proud singing, all of the faith, the hope, the clean belief of 50 years ago? Where had it gone to then, the strength, the faith, the wisdom, the sound health and substance of his lost America? Had it been only a dream then? No, it was not a dream, for he lay broad, awakening, or if a dream, then such a dream as men have lived 1,000,000 years to dream, to hope for, to achieve, but where now?" So this is a fascinating character, that being James, that Thomas Wolfe sort of explores, and we get sort of this, even though Thomas Wolfe was a younger man at the time of writing this, he's sort of looking to the future and writing in this perspective of an older, middle-aged, 50-year-old man, almost like he does with Maxwell Perkins / Foxhall Edwards in You Can't Go Home Again and The Web and the Rock. And just a beautiful way that Thomas Wolfe is able to put himself into other people's shoes, into other men and women's and different cultures' shoes, and just these beautiful, visceral, overly descriptive explanations / descriptions of what this man is doing and how he's reacting to society and how he's reacting to his servant Sugar Lips and how he's reacting to literary culture and the culture of wealth and society and all these really fascinating things. So we are going to move on now to God's Lonely Man. God's Lonely Man is, I believe, from the perspective of Eugene Gant / mostly Thomas Wolfe, and he's talking about the life of a writer, or just the life of Eugene Gant / Thomas Wolfe in general, has been incredibly lonely and incredibly tiresome in terms of perfecting his craft, and the fact that not the average person could never understand the toils and the dedication that is demanded of a writer or a musician or of a sculptor. And we get these beautiful allusions to biblical rhetoric, and he discusses these beautiful passages. My annotation here says, beautiful reflections on loneliness, the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. And Thomas Wolfe / Eugene Gant is reflecting on these biblical lessons and these apocryphal lessons that he learned from the Bible. And Thomas Wolfe reflects and shows us that some of the history's greatest men, like Christ, Dante, Dostoevsky, Alexander Swift, and Milton, have suffered lonely lives for the sake of goodness or creativity or spirituality. And Thomas Wolfe is likening himself to one of these sort of historical, biblical / literary figures. And it's absolutely fascinating and wonderful. And then we get these introspections of Christ's legacy, the love and the sorrow and the briefness of our days, as Thomas Wolfe always reminds us of. And he says here, "And now I know that though the way and meaning of Christ's life is a far, far better way and meaning than my own, yet I can never make it mine, and I think that this is true of all the other lonely men that I have seen or known about, the nameless voices, faceless atoms of this earth, as well as Job and every man and Swift. And Christ himself, who preached the life of love, was yet as lonely as any man that had ever lived." So, like I said, Thomas Wolfe is comparing and putting himself into the shoes of these ancient historical creative figures, and it's absolutely fascinating what Thomas Wolfe is able to do by taking the legacy and the story and the inspiration from one man, historically or religiously or spiritually or literary wise, and sort of giving a modern context to it, a modern explanation, and sort of showing us that life is suffering, like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky like to remind us of all the time, that life is not a bed of roses, but that the spiritual reward awaits those who put themselves in the lifestyle of Christ, or who try to aspire to live a Christ-like spiritual life passionately for your craft, whether it's writing or whatever it is that you do creatively. So now we are going to take a breather I'm not going to stop the camera or anything. I'm just going to take a breather on camera, and we are going to review the Hills Beyond. We finally made it to the actual Hills Beyond section. I appreciate you all, guys and gals, listening to me ramble the first half. Now we've finally gotten to the actual Hills Beyond. I'll show you the title page here as well. So the Hills Beyond, obviously, like we said in the beginning, is sort of this panoramic exploration celebration of George Webber's maternal ancestors, that being the Joiners. And similarly to the other themes that we've discussed throughout the pages of the Hills Beyond, we see similar themes of time, the briefness of our days, the disillusionment of the Civil War. We also sort of see this sort of communal mountain sort of pulling together of these joiners. These joiners are sort of living out in the country, and they, live and breathe and sweat by the toil of their own hands, and they hunt and they build their own things. They're craftsmen, but they sort of start to see the change that is taking place in the old/modern South, and they sort of start to see the railroad start to come in, and they see these political figures and these lawyers, and some of the joiners end up becoming lawyers, and we get these beautiful sort of stubborn, backwoods familial prejudices sometimes, but also just sort of this stubborn unwillingness to let things change and run their natural course. They're that being the joiners, they're very invested in this familial history and keeping things sort of culturally intact, like Eliza Gant perhaps, or like W.O. Gant, William Oliver Gant. And he goes all the way back into the actual migration, or the actual early colonization of where he believes or speculates or sort of creates the Joiner legacy in the state of Old Catawba. And he sort of dates us all the way back. He says here, in the month of September 1593, Fortescue, one of the hardiest and most celebrated sea adventurers of the time, set sail from Plymouth Harbor with a full cargo of provisions and material. In addition to his crew, a company of 107 men, women, and children, whom he proposed to land upon the shores of Old Catawba to establish a colony there. So he's taking us way back, even further than he did with, the Civil War days in Chickamauga and so on and so forth. And we sort of see how all of these cultural impacts, whether that was the early migrations to America, or the early settlements, I should say, to America, the conflicts with the Native Americans, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, all of this builds up into the spirit and the sort of fortitude and the strength of the Joiner clan, the Joiner family. They've seen so much over the course of their Southern history, and they are now, as we progress here, they are now ready to sort of embark and sort of keep this Southern culture that they've fought so hard to sort of exist in and live and celebrate and sort of create for themselves. They are uniquely Southern, and that is what sets the Joiner family apart from some of the other other Southern families that, or sort of what they perceive as what a Southern family is. The Joiners are uniquely Southern, as I said, and they do not play by the rules of others in the South. We sort of get these fascinating topics of South versus East versus South, or North versus South, and then the West versus the East. And we see here, the East used every weapon at its command, and when fair means failed, it did not scruple to use foul. One of the foulest and most spacious weapons that it used was the arrogant claim that the East was superior to the West in birth and breeding, and therefore born to rule. So we get these retrospections and these explorations of sort of cultural regional prejudice, if you will, and sort of the ignorance that exists in sort of these, holding to that mindset that my community, my part of the country is better or more sophisticated than yours. My annotation here says tensions of Southern history, and Thomas Wolfe and through the Joiners, Thomas Wolfe is sort of deconstructing this sort of egotistical, self-righteous Southern mentality, like that people had during that time and maybe still do. But he's not necessarily saying that Southern pride or sort of regional pride or cultural pride is a negative thing, but that it often gets attached to sort of these egotistical, materialistic, self-grandizing motivations, and that the actual motives or the actual accomplishments of that family familial heritage or lineage sort of is forgotten about in place of these more modern patriotic sort of corruptions that exist in the Old South and anywhere in the world or the country that you can imagine. And he talks about these old books called The History of the Lost Colony, and he sort of reflects on colonization, and we sort of get these different explorations of the fact that the joiners were not necessarily the colonizers or the original people that were there, but that they that sort of God gave them this land, or sort of they were given this piece of land, this community, and they want to try to live as peacefully and as fruitfully and as richly as possible as they can. Now, what Thomas Wolfe does for us next is sort of start to sketch these characters, and actually pretty fully developed, and we get these sort of, like I said, familial pride and sort of what these joiners are trying to accomplish economically and socially and sort of spiritually. So the first couple chapters centers on the history of Okatauba and sort of the familial ancestry of the joiners, and then we sort of move into Zachariah Joyner, who is the father of William Joyner, and we sort of get to meet him as well as some of the other women and some of the other cousins and other people that exist in this universe. It says here, there is some doubt about William Joyner's antecedents and no certainty whatsoever about where he came from. It is known that he came to Zebulon County because of a revolutionary land grant. So he's sort of explaining for us how all of these joiners got here, who they married, who they were related to, and sort of what they were attempting to accomplish in their society, in the limited means and sort of limited community that they had. There's another interesting character called Bear Joyner, and my annotation here says the Joyner brothers become lawyers, and that is what they are sort of raised to do, and that's sort of they become educated, and the fact that they're lawyers, we get these really fascinating introspection of sort of the perceptions of that people had of them because they were lawyers, and we sort of get this idea of sort of Southern legal corruption that exists, and the joiners were sort of trying to fight that, and they were sort of trying to be sort of social vigilantes, and they believed that their service as lawyers was decent. It was a philosophical sort of endeavor that was good for the community and good for the people that existed around them. And I said here, great descriptions of law, trials, and courts. And we sort of get this idea in The Hills Beyond, in the later sections, that the courthouse, the local backwoods sort of country bumpkin courthouse, is the location of their entire universe, and they see justice prevail sometimes, but they see a lot of corruption. And he talks about the visceral sort of aesthetic qualities of a courtroom, the destinies hanging in the air, the corrupt, judge's fist on the tabletop hammering down and sentencing people. Or he talks about the smell of the jury box full of sweaty men, casting out sentences. And he talks about the people lined up at the facade of the courthouse, and the courthouse is made to look like this, sort of ancient Greek structure of democracy and legal, sort of justice and all of these things, but that the law, by way of political position and influence and financial corruption, sort of starts to crumble, and that the courthouse is this sort of visceral representation of the entire legacy of the suffering of the Southern community. And just, I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but just these beautiful explorations of law and corruption and sort of what Southern justice meant to the joiners in this community, their limited means, their cruel punishments oftentimes, it was a young upcoming community. Laws were different back then. People had more of a familial sort of community obligation, if you will, versus sort of a big city collective sort of economic social obligation to follow the herd, if you will. These backwoods people are more dedicated and more invested and more interested in seeing their family members succeed versus wanting to see this whole entire nation sort of necessarily work together for the good of the government or the good of the president. It's more of this close-knit clan-like sort of endeavor to sort of enrich but also keep safe the overall community of the joiners. And then some of the Joiner brothers go off to military school, and then, like I said, some of them become lawyers. And through the legal system and through sort of the passage of time, the briefness of our days, as Thomas Wolfe would say, we get sort of this, and also the war. I forgot to mention the Joiners suffer through the Civil War, and we get this sort of conflicting, dogged, sort of hypocritical vision that some of the joiners, that being some of the male joiners, believe that even though the Civil War was lost to the South and the North conquered, Abraham Lincoln's government and sort of the end of slavery and all these sort of endeavors that caused the triumph of the Civil War, these old backwoods Southern joiners are sort of living in the past, and they're living in this post-war delusions of sort of Southern victory, that even though they lost the war, we still won it in a spiritual sort of metaphorical sense, even though they burned all of our communities and they took all of our horses, where all of our rations are gone. They burnt the farms. We lost, mass amounts of loved ones in the Confederacy. But in terms of morality and sort of justice, if you will, the South still won the Civil War, according to these joiners, because of the fact that they sort of compare themselves to sort of a different race of men almost, or a different community that was more upright than the antebellum sort of slave-holding Southerns. The joiners believe that because they were not part of that community, that they somehow were, being smiled upon by the gods, and that they were taken advantage of by the Union and all this sort of things. And the sort of the idea of the post-war delusions, the post-war sufferings that we see in throughout the pages of The Hills Beyond, but also later on in Thomas Wolfe's larger work, I think the celebration of the Southern culture, the Southern heritage, the Southern trauma is balanced on the sort of, how do you say, the scale of justice or sort of metaphor of the balance of the good and the evil of this celebration of Southern culture, but also recognizing the fact that these Southern communities and these Southern people have this horrendous trauma and this horrendous delusion as a result of the Civil War and slavery and poverty and suffering and corruption and all of these things that exists in the universe of Thomas Wolfe and the Joiners. And towards the end, my annotation here says the visceral physical descriptions of Colonel Joiner's tyrannical demeanor and old age. And Colonel Joiner is sort of works his way up from the military academy, and sort of by the help of his family. And he's says here, he always sitting soldierly erect, gripping the head of his supporting king with palsied hands, brown with the blotches of old age, and glowering out to the left and right beneath bushy eyebrows of coursed white, with kindling glances of his fierce old eyes, at the same time clenching his jaw grimly and working sternly at his lips beneath his close-cropped grizzled mustache. And we get these sort of scenes of Colonel Joiner being paraded through the streets of this community, and they're sort of all worshiping him, that because he is like one of the elders, if you will, and he's been around to tell the tales. And sort of fast forwarding to the end a little bit here, we get the horrors and the critiques of war. Good men, and there's this beautiful quote here that says, "Good men go to war, but they are not made by war." In other words, men are good when they go to war or are hired or drafted or forced, whatever. Those men are good, but that the fact that the war itself, the carnage, the fighting, holding a gun, that is not what makes a good man. These men were either good before or they become good after, but the war does not make a good man. And I think, to me, that's one of Thomas Wolfe's most visceral and profound anti-war statements there, that a good man is not made by war. I mean, how else could you really take that? And we have these further delusions of the South, the loss of the slave rhetoric. Says here, don't you realize that That's the thing that ails us in this South. It's not the war. It's not the war that ruined us. Most of us, he went on grimly, were ruined long before the war. It's all rubbish for most of us to talk of what we lost because we had nothing to begin with. And the real truth of the matter is that we got off on the wrong foot at the beginning. We made a bad start. Cried Robert Joyner. To wipe out that whole fake and shoddy way of life and to begin anew, to get started right. For every fake we had before the war, we have 10 new ones now, and each of them is 10 times as bad. Some of the people back before the war did have some basis for their pretensions. If they lived in houses with fake columns, or at least some of them did not own such houses, and although their workers ate them out of house and home, at least some of them did own them. But look at the kind of people you meet everywhere today. You have people talking of the great estates and houses that they lost, who were born in shacks and raised on hog and hominy. And he's sort of getting into this bitter rhetoric of sort of these post-war Southern people that are delusioned and still butthurt by not only the results of the Civil War, but they're sort of hanging on to this less than stellar lifestyle that they even had before the war, but they're sort of using the Civil War and they're using sort of societal progress and sort of social trauma as a result to blame their entire familial heritage and existence and sort of output or lack of output, sort of socially, morally, and spiritually on the Civil War or the government perhaps, but that the fact that the South was always, at least parts of it rather, were always sort of these backwoods, sort of corrupt, prejudiced atmospheres where the Civil War basically just brought those inconsistencies or those evils to the forefront. Now, there's a lot of different ways you could sort of analyze that. I'm not saying that Thomas Wolfe is necessarily advocating for the idea that everything was worse before the war or that everything was necessarily better after the war. No, these people did suffer. They lost loved ones, but they were clinging on to this old lifestyle, even up in these mountain communities where the Joiners existed in, or these more rural communities, I should say. They were not necessarily huge, wealthy, slave-owning plantation owners or really wealthy government officials or, big wealthy industrial constituents or something, but they, lost a lot in that so-called progress after the Southern Civil War, but they also were clinging to this sort of impoverished, not necessarily the best life that they sort of had before, but they're sort of looking back on it fondly with rose-colored glasses. Now, Grandfather Joyner, that man that we were just discussing, sort of becomes this sort of symbol or a manifestation of war. And he says here, he is simply a product of war, an example of what war does to 8 men out of 10. Don't drag his wooden leg into it. If you do, it will blind you with false pity and you'll never be able to see the thing straight. Then you'll be as a big sentimental fool as he is. So this old Joyner grandfatherly guy is sort of walking around with a wooden leg and he's being paraded through the streets and he sort of is holding on to this heroic idea of war. Even though he got his leg blown off, he is still advocating for the fact that what he did was heroic. And yes, it was in some ways, but he's sort of saying that he had to suffer for the desires and the visions of other people that sort of corrupted the rural Southern intentions and sort of put them into this other universe of political gain and financial gain and sort of destroying this entire economic hierarchy, but that some of the Joyner families did not have necessarily social and political financial interests in sort of what sort of caused and made the Civil War start from the beginning. My last and final annotation here, I believe, is familial nostalgia, the wartime heritage as sacred as legend, not to be forgotten. And that's basically what the Hills Beyond is. Hopefully not too many spoilers, but we've gotten to the end of it finally after this really long rant lecture here / conversation that we're having. But the Hills Beyond is basically sort of a more, a more diluted or a more exact, specific exploration of some of the other characters that we see in Thomas Wolfe's universe previously, but it's sort of a really wonderful distillation, exploration, more specific panoramic view of sort of these clash of cultures that exists in Thomas Wolfe's universe, but also sort of the familial heritage of celebration, appreciating where you came from, but also being able to point out your family shortcomings, whether that's your ancient ancestors or what your family has become sort of socially, politically, spiritually, and morally now, and what we can learn from exploring our family heritage on sort of an autobiographical social level, and the fact that we're not existing in this sort of bubble, whether you're in the South or in the West or in the North or in the East or wherever you are on this planet Earth, that your family's footprints have influenced the life that you live now, and whether that's socially or spiritually or economically, but you are a product of your familial heritage. And Thomas Wolfe does that so beautifully and brilliantly for us in the pages of The Hills Beyond. And we can see how there is not necessarily a black and white sort of limited either or perspective to the Southern trauma and the Southern history and the Civil War and the post-Civil War, but that depending on what your family, where and what your family came from, the financially, sort of spiritually or culturally, that in fact is what influences the modern perspectives of sort of societal progress, Southern history, Southern heritage, and that not everything is necessarily contingent upon what the mass population or the mass political sort of sectors of society sort of encourage us to believe, but that in fact, if you go back into the history of your own family, that in fact is where the truth lies into how you perceive the world, and the fact that you cannot escape your family heritage on a spiritual and social level. So please leave your thoughts and comments and questions below regarding The Hills Beyond, and let me know what you think about Thomas Wolfe. Please follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Please follow us on Substack at In-Depth Literature. Make sure you guys check out the Thomas Wolfe playlist as well as the other author analysis playlist that I've curated just for you guys and gals. Like and share this video. I would really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all in the next video. Happy reading.